Hi, I'm Serena, and this is my video presentation for my comparative analysis on a contemporary local playwright. Now, my choice was to look at some of the works written by Mr. Lucas Ho. He is a writer, an actor, and an educator here in Singapore. A very brief background about him is that he graduated from the National University of Singapore with a first-class honors in English literature. Currently, he is a associate artist with Checkpoint Theatre. At a very young age of 32, he's considered one of the local playwrights to look out for in the Singapore scene. Now today we will be looking at three of his works. The very first one is The Artist Who, which was written in 2011, followed by The Last Chief Minister of Singapore, which was written in 2013. And lastly, Welcome to the Next Page, The Historian's Tour, The Cleaner's Account, which was written in 2014. Now I will be analyzing on some of his character depiction, his plot development, his style of writing, and possibly his thematic concern. So let's not wait and move it! The first play we'll be looking at is The Artist Who, which was directed by Claire Wong and staged by Checkpoint Theatre in 2011. I read this in hard copy because it was published by Checkpoint Theatre in 2012. And it was a very interesting read because the scene was set in Malaysia and it opened with only two characters itself. The female was in her early 20s. She's a Malay girl named Aisha Fazreen, and some of the characteristics that I've observed from the play itself is that she's fashionable, she's polite, she's tech-savvy, she's observant, she's perceptive, she's inquisitive, and she's knowledgeable in the fine arts, and also she's very genuine and she's very persuasive, and she has her business smarts. Her main job was a junior art curator, so her work consists of sort of supporting and nurturing artistic endeavors within the ASEAN region itself, and therefore which leads her to the male character, who is Simon Harewood. He is a white man in his mid-50s. He's sort of disorganized, he has this very disorganized work studio which opens the scene, and we understand from the beginning that he's a watercolor artist. And he's very straightforward. He enjoys being taken care of. Some of the things that I observed is he can be kind of verbally racist. He's sort of low-key and he enjoys personal space and privacy, and he's a bit quick humor. In the play itself, Simon openly disses Aisha because she actually comes to him with a business idea, a business concept to sort of expand his work to a wider number of audience, because she realizes that him as an artist his work was undervalued, and she appreciates his work, and it was obvious that he didn't appreciate her input at first. So Aisha tries to reason with Simon, telling him that you are so detailed in your painting, but they are just lost when you commercialize them and print them out in postcards. So it becomes apparent that Aisha is in fact a very perceptive and very observant art curator, and she notices things that people tend to overlook. And Aisha also notices the trace of political element in Simon's painting. And this is where Simon sort of realizes that, oh, okay, this girl actually, knows what she's talking about. And it's also during the middle of the part of the play that we were introduced to another internationally well-received painter by contrast, and his name was mentioned to be Lucas American. And Lucas was depicted as a very mysterious and very anonymous sort of painter, and he has a very daring choice in terms of his work. He explores pop art, and he will fuse Malaysian icons with Western themes, and he even reconceptualizes the racial classification in his paintings. And the irony is that we realize later on that Simon was in fact Lucas. And the irony in that play is that the work of Lucas have traveled the map under an alias name, and identity, while the actual artist himself was a white man who is less traveled. And Lucas' work was hailed as artfully thought-provoking and stunning by art critics, whereas Simon was just nowhere. He was just stuck in Malaysia in his sort of stereotypical sort of painting, when in actual fact the two of them are the same person. And at this point of time, Aisha's charmingness came through, and you can sort of sense Simon seemed attracted to her by this time, having complimented her as being attractive for her smarts and at the beginning of the play, and then again sort of hint a little bit of sexual interest on her. And at the very end, when he suggests that he hopes that his white racial background will actually help him to have an intimate moment with Aisha, and then Aisha begins to piece that puzzle together and figure out that Simon was in fact Lucas himself. And from that point of time, there was a power change in terms of the dynamics, because now Aisha knows Simon's well-kept secret and his identity, and Simon begins to open up to her at this point of time. And I think this play really delves into like the saddened truth of how artists are doomed by fate, and only the people with the upper hand have total power to sort of bring you up or down. And the character goes into this discussion of this ingenious plan to sustain Simon's career and his work by marketing it to a niche group of audiences, and so that they could eventually use Lucas' well-sought reputation to sort of upskill his own value, and finally then he could reveal himself. And I think this play was really smart because it sort of it is about trying to outsmart the social political sort of system in power play, and for either of their personal gain. And I think in this sense, the plot itself was linear, and it moves on straight on to a climax at the very end, and it leaves you wondering at the end, so what happened between the two characters and what happened to them exactly. But you don't know, but I think it was meant to be like this, and that's how it should be like. The second play we'll be looking at is Last Chief Minister of Singapore. I really love this play. I love it so much. It was directed by Zhong Zhijian, and there was a stage reading for it in 2013 at the Substation. What I really like about this piece was it was a piece of history that was so understated. When I was reading this play, the question that came up to me was, who was the last Chief Minister of Singapore? We all have heard of David Marshall. We all know about Lee Kuan Yew. So what happened exactly between the period that David Marshall stepped down as the first Chief Minister and before Lee Kuan Yew stepped up as our first Prime Minister? Apparently, we had a second Chief Minister in between. And Lucas really delved into this part of the missing, ambiguous part of Singapore history, which was very insightful for me because we were never really taught about this part of history in our school textbook. According to the play, it highlights that Mr. Lim Yew Hock actually married his wife, Chia Kim Nyo, in 1937. And this was during the period that was pre-Japanese occupation. And it was also mentioned that he lost his father at a very young age, and he met his wife when he was 16, and he was working as a clerk. And they eventually had 4 children together, a son and 3 daughters, who were briefly mentioned in the play. But the play itself was set in 1981, 44 years after their marriage. And I think this was intentional because Mr. Lim Yew Hock actually passed away 3 years after that, in 1984. 1994. And in that play itself, he would have already divorced his wife and haven't met her in many years because he went into sort of like a hiding or a very low profile sort of life in Saudi Arabia. And in that play itself, he was reminiscing back in the old times, back in the 1930s, how Madame Cha King-nyo was actually a very supportive wife um, to him while he was very heavily politically involved in the scene in Singapore and later on in Malaysia. It also talked about how he was fighting for the rights of Singapore, how David Marshall actually didn't really have a very good relationship with the British rule because he was very firm on wanting to be independent, and Mr. Lim was actually the one who had a very genuine and great relationship with the British rule, which eventually managed to have a proper negotiation with them, and eventually we managed to have an agreement with them um, to be self-governed, and how PAP actually took that opportunity to sort of gain the trust of the people, and eventually how Mr. Lim lost a lot of support from the Chinese majority within Singapore itself, and gradually he disappeared from the political scene in Singapore. It also mentioned the episode of his disappearance in the 1960s, how his marriage fell apart, and how Malaysia actually took him in, and so on. It was a very insightful read. I think Mr. Lucas actually did a really great job in terms of not portraying him as a victim. A lot of reading I actually read up when I was doing my Google research on whether or not this person actually exists. And I feel like this is such an important read for me as a Singaporean to understand what exactly happened. And in this play itself, maybe because Lucas had the guidance from mentors and also directors and actors, and he had 2 years to sort of work on this play, I would say a very great attempt at trying to write out the story of one of the key political figure in Singapore. That's it. Welcome to the next page, the historian's tour. The cleaner's account will be the very last play that I will be analyzing on. It was directed by Chong Chi-Sian and was staged in March 2014. Now, this play itself has 5 characters, and it opened the scene at a bookstore, and the bookstore is called The Next Page. There were 3 docents present with a crowd of audiences, and they were touring around the bookstore trying to educate the public about the trajectory of the building, the history of it. So for me as a reader, I felt like I was being brought back to the whole trajectory of the Parliament House, what happened to it back in the days until the current period. So the whole play basically brings us back to what happened to this building. From its current state as a brick and mortar bookstore, to when it was a boutique hotel, to when it was a dance club for the niche crowd, to when it was the art house, to its very humble beginning as the Parliament House for David Marshall, our first Chief Minister of Singapore. Within the story itself, Heston, the more experienced docent, he begins to use threat on Alice when she insists on joining the tour, even though she hasn't paid for the tour itself. And it sort of reminds me of this authoritarian power that we see in Singapore, like, oh, if you don't listen to me, then I will just threaten you. Genevieve, at some point of time in the play, she actually broke the fourth wall and she interacts with the audience and she said like, oh, please don't post this commotion on stop. It's sort of like a reminder of what's so common nowadays. And Rahiza, the janitor, her introduction to the plot quickly really lends a voice to the marginalized population, and we sort of see through her eyes, and it was mentioned like she sees everything, she hears everything, but she always is hidden in silence, and people don't really see her. She's the forgotten one, and it sheds some light between her relationship with her and her son, who represents, I think, the current teen generation, where they're constantly on the computer, downloading torrents, which questions ethics, I think. Rahiza, towards the end of the play, also speaks about complacency and ignorance and how it becomes the downfall of anyone. And this sort of attitude seems to carry forward to the current generation, where they have this sense of self-entitlement. What I get out of this play is it seems to question us what is public and private spaces, and how do you draw the line and decide. The second question that came up to me is, what gives you the right to stop someone from entering a public space? Third question that came up to me was, if art was meant to educate and if it's meant to be shared, why do we touch such knowledge? And what is considered fair? Can compromises be made? And if rules were made by people, can an alternative be offered in situations like this? And so this brings me to my conclusion on the works of Mr. Lucas Ho. While reading his play and researching about him, it is quite apparent that he has interest to write about social issues and political issues, but not necessarily right in your face. He has a way of creating his characters to sort of hide that layer, and it becomes a very interesting read for me. I also noticed that he is very heavily involved in the playwriting scene in Singapore, and he has gone through a lot of mentorship from amazing people, and it's great that he's passing this on to the future generation. And he's an educator here in Singapore. I look forward to more of his works in future, even longer plays, because right now the plays that I've read, it was not exactly a full-length long play, so they all move in a very linear direction and goes up in the climax, and then it's up to the audience to sort of decipher what is the ending. So it will be nice for him to have his works incubate and sort of build up so that his characters will have like a stronger development. Yeah, so this is it.